The air was heavy with the scent of palm oil as Ikemefuna navigated his canoe through the narrow waterways of Orokuku. His name had become synonymous with wealth in the region, and merchants from far and wide sought his business. Yet, as he paddled deeper into the sacred grove, his heart raced with fear and anticipation. The night was moonless, the path lit only by the glow of fireflies. He had been summoned by the priestess of Ayla, the goddess of the earth, and no one ignored her call. At the heart of the grove stood a towering Iroko tree, its roots twisting into the ground like a giant's claws. The priestess emerged, her face painted with white chalk, her voice like the whisper of the wind. "Ikemefuna," she called, her gaze piercing through the shadows. "You seek greatness beyond measure, wealth that will make your name immortal." Ikemefuna nodded, his throat dry. He had come prepared to pay any price, for he was tired of the slow progress of his business. He craved the riches that would elevate him above his rivals. The priestess spread a calabash of kola nuts before him and began to chant. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she revealed the terms of the pact. Ayla would grant him unmatched prosperity, but in return, his firstborn son would belong to her. Ikemefuna hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had no children yet, and the thought of sacrificing a life he had not even created seemed distant, almost unreal. He nodded, sealing the covenant with his blood. Years later, the covenant became a distant memory. His wealth grew beyond his wildest dreams, and he built a family, 3 sons and a loving wife. The villagers envied his success, but Ikemefuna carried his secret like a stone tied to his neck. But Ayla does not forget, and neither does she forgive. The wind howled that night, carrying with it a voice only Ikemefuna could hear. "It is time." The harmattan breeze blew fiercely across the village, rustling the thatched roofs and chilling the air. It was the night of Obina's initiation into the men's council, a proud moment for any father. Ikemefuna sat in the central compound, surrounded by family and elders, as Obina, his firstborn, knelt before the council. The boy was everything Ikemefuna had ever hoped for: strong, intelligent, and courageous. "Your son is destined for greatness," the chief priest declared, drawing cheers from the crowd. Yet, amid the celebration, Ikemefuna's heart sank. The priest's words were a haunting reminder of the covenant he had made years ago. The festivities ended late into the night, and as the family returned home, the first omen appeared. A white dove perched on the roof of their compound, silent and unmoving. In Igbo tradition, such a sight was an ill omen. Ikemefuna tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but his wife, Nika, noticed his unease. "Are you troubled?" she asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ikemefuna shook his head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing. Go inside and rest." But sleep eluded him that night. The wind howled outside, and the voice came again, whispering his name. "Ikemefuna, it is time." He bolted upright, sweat drenching his body. The room was empty, but the air was thick with a presence he could not see. The next day, misfortune struck. Obina, while tending to the goats, was bitten by a snake. The venom worked quickly, leaving him unconscious. The village healer was summoned, and while Obina's life was spared, the healer's words sent chills down Ikemefuna's spine. "This boy has been marked," the healer said, her eyes narrowing as she studied the wound. A spirit lays claim to him. Ikemefuna's chest tightened. The pact he had buried deep in his memory was resurfacing, and he realized that Ayla had come to collect her debt. As Obina lay weak and feverish, Ikemefuna knew he could no longer ignore the truth. The goddess was watching, and the cost of his wealth was about to be paid. The silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by Obina's labored breathing. Ikemefuna sat by his son's bedside, his hands trembling as he wiped the boy's fevered brow. Nika stood at the doorway, her eyes filled with fear. "What is happening to him, Ikemefuna? Why would a spirit lay claim to our son?" Her words cut deep, but Ikemefuna remained silent. He couldn't bring himself to reveal the truth, not yet. "He will be fine," he said, his voice cracking. "The healer has done her work. Obina is strong." But even as he spoke, he knew the words were hollow. Ayla would not be denied. Days turned into weeks, and Obina's health improved. But strange occurrences began to plague the household. Goats died inexplicably, the family's crops withered despite the rains, and at night, Ikemefuna could hear whispers in the wind, calling his name. One evening, unable to bear the weight of his guilt, Ikemefuna ventured into the forest to seek the priestess who had brokered the pact. The grove was darker than he remembered, the air thick with the scent of decay. He called out for the priestess, but the only response was the rustling of leaves and the distant cry of an owl. Just as he turned to leave, the priestess appeared, her face painted in patterns of white chalk, her voice cold and unyielding. "You have come too late, Ikemefuna," she said. "The goddess waits no longer." I need more time, he pleaded, falling to his knees. Spare my son, take me instead. The priestess shook her head. The pact cannot be changed. You promised your firstborn, and now his destiny is sealed. Delay will only bring greater suffering. Desperate, Ikemefuna returned home and called a family meeting. With Nika and their younger son seated before him, he confessed everything: the pact, the wealth, the price. Nika's face contorted with rage and despair. You sold our son's life for riches, she cried, her voice breaking. How could you do this to your own blood? Their younger son stared in shock, and for the first time, Ikemefuna saw the extent of the damage he had caused. But Obinna, who had overheard the conversation, simply stared at his father, his expression unreadable. Is my life worth your wealth, father? Obinna finally asked, his voice cold and steady. And with that question, the family's fragile unity began to crumble. The days following Ikemefuna's confession were heavy with tension. Nika refused to speak to him, and the once lively household was shrouded in silence. Obinna, though outwardly calm, grew distant, spending most of his time at the village shrine or wandering the outskirts of the forest. Ikemefuna felt the weight of his betrayal in every glance, every unspoken word, but the goddess was not done with them. One fateful night, as the family slept, a thunderstorm swept through the village. The winds howled, and lightning illuminated the sky in violent flashes. Ikemefuna awoke to the sound of a deafening crash. Rushing outside, he found the massive iroko tree in the compound split in two, its roots clawing upward as if ripped apart by an unseen force. The villagers gathered at dawn, whispering among themselves. The chief priest arrived, his face grim. This is not the work of man, he declared. The goddess is angry. She demands justice. Ikemefuna knew what the priest meant, but he refused to surrender his son. He pleaded with the villagers, offering sacrifices of livestock and gold. But the priest shook his head. Ella will not be appeased with wealth, he said. The debt must be paid in blood. Desperate, Ikemefuna devised a plan. He would take Obinna far away, beyond the reach of the village and the goddess's wrath. That night, he packed provisions and woke his son. We are leaving, he whispered. Obinna stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. But as they stepped out of the compound, the air grew still, and a chilling voice echoed through the night. You cannot run, Ikemefuna. My reach is endless. Suddenly, Obinna collapsed, writhing in pain. His body convulsed as if gripped by an invisible force. Nika and the younger sons rushed out, screaming, but there was nothing they could do. Stop this, Ikemefuna cried, falling to his knees. Take me instead. The voice laughed, cold and unfeeling. The pact is sealed. Your son belongs to me. As Obinna's breathing slowed, Ikemefuna realized the goddess had given him no choice. If he did nothing, his son would die, and the wrath of the goddess would consume his entire family. Time was running out, and he had to decide: fight the inevitable or find a way to outwit a god. The village was silent as dawn broke, but Ikemefuna's compound was filled with the wails of Nika and the cries of his younger sons. Obinna lay unconscious, his breathing shallow, his body marked by strange burns that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The goddess was closing in, and Ikemefuna knew the end was near. Desperation clawed at him as he remembered the priestess's words: delay will only bring greater suffering. But Ikemefuna was not a man to surrender easily. If Ella demanded blood, then perhaps there was a way to outmaneuver her. Summoning the strength of a father's love, Ikemefuna made his way to the village shrine, carrying a calabash of offerings. The villagers followed at a distance, their curiosity mingled with fear. When he arrived at the sacred grove, he knelt before the altar, calling on the goddess. Ella, he cried, his voice breaking. I am here. I have come to bargain with you. The wind rose, and the priestess appeared, her face painted in somber patterns. Behind her, the air shimmered, and the presence of the goddess filled the grove. Your time has run out, Ikemefuna, the priestess intoned. The boy's life is mine. Ikemefuna stood, his voice firm despite his trembling hands. You gave me wealth, and I owe you a debt. But take me instead. My life is worth far more than his. The grove grew eerily quiet. The priestess tilted her head, her painted face inscrutable. You would give your life for his. Yes, Ikemefuna said. A father protects his children, no matter the cost. Take my blood, my soul, but let my son live. The silence stretched, and then the wind shifted. The voice of the goddess echoed, not with wrath, but with a strange note of respect. Very well, Ikemefuna. Your love has redeemed your son, but your debt remains. You shall live, but without the wealth you so coveted. At once, the grove darkened, and Ikemefuna felt the weight of his fortune lifting, as if a great emptiness had replaced it. When he returned home, the compound was intact, but the signs of his former prosperity were gone. Obinna awoke, his strength restored, and Nika embraced him with tears streaming down her face. The villagers murmured in awe, speaking of a father's sacrifice and the mercy of the gods. Though stripped of his wealth, Ikemefuna felt a strange peace. He had lost everything but gained what mattered most, his family. And as the days turned into years, Ikemefuna worked humbly as a farmer, teaching his sons the value of integrity and love. The goddess's whispers faded into silence, and the shadows of the covenant became a distant memory, one that reminded the family of the cost of greed and the power of redemption.